Right. Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth and final edition of the FIA and AI Palette webinar. My name is May and I'm from Food Industry Asia. Firstly, thank you for tuning in. I hope everyone is safe and well. Before we begin, I'd like to share with you the format of today's session. It will be around 25 minutes of presentation done by our speaker, followed up by around 25 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the question box and we will get to it during the Q&A segment. Just a note that all attendees will be muted for the entire session and the webinar will be recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for the day, Salome, who is the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette. Salome, please.
Thanks for that, May. And thanks to everybody who has tuned in today. All across Asia, consumers are dealing with a new normal. On one hand, on-ground research has definitely become more challenging after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the other hand, it has become even more important for companies in the food and beverage space to understand how consumer behavior is changing and evolving. So we at AI Palette, in association with Food Industry Asia, have put together this series of webinars in which we will be using artificial intelligence to understand how consumer behavior and food preferences are changing and how consumers are adapting to this new normal. For the discussion today, we will be focusing on the Indian market. With that, let's dive straight in. So we'll start by telling you a little bit about the methodology that we use to do the analysis at AI Palette. Then we'll talk about the key drivers and motivations which are influencing consumers' decisions, specifically in the Indian context. Look at the categories which are growing and declining. Then we'll cover emerging patterns in consumption and demand for food. And lastly, we'll end with a regional analysis, which is, of course, important for a diverse country like India. With that, a little bit about myself. I'm Salome Naik. I'm the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette. And I come with a background in brand management across Asia and the US. AI Palette is a Singapore-based startup which is backed by the government of Singapore. We work with consumer goods companies to essentially use artificial intelligence to predict and identify trends as they evolve in real time. We also help our clients understand what are the underlying drivers behind each and every one of these trends. Let's next look at what is the approach that we use for this analysis. So firstly, our approach is that we focus on data specific to food and beverages, and we train our algorithm on this data. The reason that is important is because the words that consumers use with respect to food tend to be very different with respect to any other context. For example, the word hot, when it is used in the context of food, typically refers something which is spicy and rich in chili, while hot used in any other context refers to the temperature. So which is why we train our algorithm on food and beverage data specifically. Then we look at the data sources which are specific to a market. So we look at the most popular data sources for any given market. And lastly, our algorithm is language agnostic. What that essentially means is that our algorithm is trained to understand multiple non-English languages. Next, looking at the methodology that we have used for this analysis. So firstly, we started by looking at what are the most relevant and local popular public data sources in the Indian context. And where are consumers having organic conversations about their preferences and choices? This data not only helps us identify trends in real time, it's also available to us even during the social distancing and lockdown measures. Then we work to collect these millions of data points, run our proprietary AI algorithm on top of that. And lastly, we identify changes in behavior and patterns which are emerging. Typically, we actually present this in the form of a dashboard to our clients. But today, for ease of sharing, we've put together this report. With that, let's look at what are the data sources that we've taken into account for today's analysis. So across the board, we've looked at the most popular social media sources when it comes to food in the Indian context, like Instagram and Twitter. And then we've also looked at data from the Google search engine. Overall, for this analysis, we've looked at 54.6 million data points. And a data point is actually much more than a mention. We also look at likes, comments, and shares, as well as the volume of search queries on Google. And this helps us measure popularity and resonance and consumer interest in a specific topic. The data we've looked at is from January of 2019 to April of 2020. The 2019 data helps us establish a baseline, and then we've dug deeper into the 2020 data to see the patterns that are emerging. With that, I'd love to share our findings with you today. So first, looking at the key drivers and motivations which are influencing the Indian consumers. So the first driver that came up was health. Of course, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, consumers are influenced by health and wellness, and there is an increased demand and increased consumer interest in this topic. But the consumer conversations are about inner and outer well-being. So they are about much more than just immunity or immunity boosting. As you can see from the graph here, topics of the conversations around health are actually at an all-time high, and we've established this trend based on 16.97 million consumer data points. But health is a very broad topic. Let's dig deeper to see specifically what consumers are talking about. So firstly, let's look at immunity. So overall, what we see is that in the Indian context, there has definitely been a significant surge in immunity as a topic, as can be seen in the first graph on top. But overall, consumers are relying on natural home remedies to boost their immunity rather than multivitamins and vitamin supplements. However, there is definitely an increased consumer interest in vitamin C as well. And further in the presentation, we look at what are the ingredients which consumers are relying on to boost their vitamin C levels. Then I spoke about outer health. So what we see is that beyond just immunity, consumers are also interested in other aspects of health like fitness, which saw a significant surge in consumer interest during this lockdown period. And that's primarily driven by consumers wanting to tackle essentially the side effects of the fact that lifestyle for a lot of people has become very sedentary during the lockdown. There was also some increase in consumer interest around nutrition and protein as well. And protein is a broader topic which we will actually be digging deeper into further in the presentation. Let's look at the next driver which stood out and which our algorithm picked out, which was taste. So overall, consumers have a very strong emotional connection with food in the Indian market. So they really relied on food that is tasty and delicious to help them feel better and to restore their sense of normalcy. Taste as a topic of conversation is really at an all-time high, and this was on the basis of 16.24 million data points. Going to the next driver that has emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic is packaging. So overall, packaging is really turning out to be a key influencer, which is influencing consumer decisions. But packaging is a very broad topic. Let's see specifically what it is that consumers are looking for. So when it comes to packaging, overall, there were three main aspects of packaging which consumers are talking about. Firstly, it is It is packaging that enables prolonged storage, for instance, frozen or canned. And this particularly saw a peak in the when the lockdown was first initiated in the Indian market. At the same time, there are also consumer concerns around hygiene, with the Indian consumers talking about a preference for food which is packed in boxes, for instance. The third aspect which consumers spoke about when it comes to packaging is that of size. So size is really turning out to be an important driver or an important factor in the decision-making process. And that is really driven by storage constraints during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, let's look at another driver which has emerged to be important specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is distribution. So overall, as the graph here below shows, distribution as a topic of conversation is at an all-time high, growing almost 900% in March 2020. And overall, the conversations are primarily negative. So let's see what are the negative aspects which consumers are concerned about when it comes to distribution as a driver. So firstly, what we see is that there has been a shift to online channels, and there has been increased consumer interest when it comes to shopping online and on e-commerce. That is what is reflected in this graph at the bottom right hand corner. And when it comes to online delivery, there are both positives and negatives. On one hand, the aspect that really resonates positively with consumers is the fact that e-commerce allows for contactless delivery. On the other hand, there are also consumer frustrations around delivery delays and availability concerns. So essentially, while there is growing increased interest in online as a channel, there are both positives and negatives to this story. Next, let's look at another important driver specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is price. So overall, we can see that the Indian consumers are definitely becoming more frugal and more price conscious as a result of the economic hardships that have come as that the virus has brought about. So this was specifically reflected in increased consumer interest in discounted items or affordable items. So we can definitely see price emerging as an important driver in this context. With that, we can now look at what are the growing and the declining product categories which have essentially emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. So firstly, let's look at fresh and frozen food. So overall, we saw significantly increased consumer interest in fresh food, whether that is fruits, vegetables, or freshly cooked food as a whole. And that's primarily driven by the very strong Indian belief that fresh food is healthier. At the same time, especially during the lockdown, what we saw was that there was an increase in consumer interest when it comes to ready to cook items as well, like noodles and frozen food. And that was driven primarily by not only the stockpiling and the storage, but also the lack of household help, especially in tier 1 cities. The next category that we wanted to bring to your notice was that of cooking essentials. So overall, COVID-19 has really led to a significant increase in home cooking, and that has definitely translated to an increase in demand for cooking essentials like rice, lentils, or even seasoning and masalas. So there definitely overall has been an increase in demand for cooking essentials. With that, we look at the next product category, which is snacking and comfort food. So overall, what we saw was that as a result of the pandemic, consumers definitely snacked a lot more. So there was a snackification of meals, which was primarily driven by the fact that during the lockdown, consumers struggled to stick to their daily regimes and routines. At the same time, consumers also indulged more, which was seen in an increased consumer interest in items like pizzas, for instance. And that was driven by the fact that they were relying on comfort food like pizza to make themselves feel better. Coming to the next product category of immunity boosting foods. So when it comes to this category, what we saw was that consumers are heavily relying on trusted natural home remedies to help them develop immunity. There was an increase in consumer interest for home remedies like garlic, Indian gooseberry or amla, as well as turmeric. And essentially, consumers are looking to boost their vitamin C levels, specifically with respect to because of the association of vitamin C with immunity. With that, let's discuss the next product category of protein. So overall, what we saw was that animal protein definitely was hit, essentially driven by two main factors. Firstly, the fact that a lot of the markets were closed, so consumers did not have access to animal protein. At the same time, there was a lot of misinformation which was spread on social media, which also resulted in decreased consumer interest for animal protein. And we'll also look a little bit further in the presentation into how this has impacted vegetarian and vegetarianism in India. With that, after looking at the growing and the declining product categories, we now want to highlight some important patterns which have emerged in the consumption and the demand for food. So firstly, what we saw was that there was a significant increase in consumer interest when it comes to homemade or cooking at home. And consumers are really recreating their favorite recipes in the comfort of their own home. This has resulted in increase in consumer interest, not only for their favorite food, but also other types of food like street food, for instance. As a result of this, there is an overall increase in consumer interest for simpler recipes. So this was reflected in consumers actively searching for food which is easy to prepare or easy to cook, both of which saw a significant increase in demand over the time period that we have analyzed. And this was essentially driven by the fact that a lot of households had to deal with the lack of household help. There was another interesting trend which has come up, which is the 3-ingredient recipes, where essentially consumers are interested in simple recipes which have few ingredients, which they can whip up. And these are typically ingredients which are already stocked up in their pantries. A great example of that is Dalgona coffee, for instance, which is made with instant coffee. The next pattern that we wanted to highlight was that of diet preferences. So overall, as we discussed previously, animal protein was hard hit because of misinformation that was spread, that was spread during the virus. At the same time, there was also limited access to animal protein. But this has resulted in an increase in consumer interest when it comes to vegetarian diets as well as eggs. So overall, as you can see from these two graphs, there has definitely been a surge in consumer interest when it comes to vegetarian diets and eggs. Eggs, in addition to being a rich source of proteins, were also incorporated in a lot of recipes with respect to baking as well. So that also helped in the increased demand for eggs. And the last demand pattern that we want to highlight today is that of food wastage. So overall, Indian consumers are definitely very wary of food wastage, and that is essentially driven by concerns around food shortage, as well as economic hardships that they expect to deal with as in the aftermath of the virus. And a few themes really stood out when we look at the broader topics of food wastage. So firstly, as the graph here shows, food wastage has seen a significant increase in consumer interest during the COVID-19 pandemic times. And the themes that really stood out are firstly, increase in consumer interest and awareness around how the disruption in supply chain has impacted or has led to wastage of food, because the food is no longer being able to be transported to the markets. At the same time, the second pattern that emerged was consumers actively talking about how they are limiting the number of items that they consume in any meal. So both these two themes are the main themes that emerged when it comes to food wastage. The next aspect that we wanted to talk about, which is particularly important in a diverse country like India, is how these trends emerged differently in the different regions in the country. So firstly, when we looked at the drivers across the four regions, what we saw was that there were more similarities than there were differences. So overall, health, taste, packaging, and distribution have emerged as key drivers in all four regions across the country. Price was more important in places in the north, west, and the south, while food safety was more important in the east. Looking at some other regional differences, what we also saw was that when it comes to the ready to eat category, there was more of an increased consumer interest for this category in the east and the west. And in the south as well, this category has shown sustained increase during the pandemic. The next aspect that we wanted to highlight when it comes to the regional analysis is that of immunity. So overall, when we analyzed immunity as a topic of conversation, what we saw was that there was more of an increase in consumer interest for immunity in places that have been particularly hard hit. So in states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi, which have really been hard hit by the coronavirus, we saw a significantly higher increase in health and immunity as a topic of conversation. Next, looking at what are the immunity boosting ingredients which consumers in these four regions really relied on to help them cope with the virus. So when it came to ingredients and trends, what we saw was that first of all, there were a lot of similarities between the west, east, and the south, where in all these three regions, garlic has shown a significant increase in consumer interest, while in the north, consumers seem to be relying most on home remedies which incorporate turmeric to help them boost their immunity. At the same time, when we looked at multivitamins and vitamins and supplements, what we saw was that overall, only the western state of Maharashtra is where consumers are relying on this, and which can also be attributed to the fact that it was particularly hard hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. But overall, when it comes to COVID immunity boosting ingredients, there is a much more reliance on home remedies and trusted ingredients to boost immunity. With that, we come to the end of the insights that we had to share with you today. So I'll end with this thought. So essentially, now as the Indian economy starts opening up, we will definitely be keeping a very close eye on how these patterns evolve. We expect a black swan event like COVID-19 to, in some sense, permanently change consumer behavior in particular aspects. So do stay tuned for our next round of reports in which we will be covering which of these emerging patterns have led to permanent changes in behavior. So thanks for joining today, and we hope we've helped you understand this new normal that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about a little bit better. If you're interested in understanding how you can use AI to understand your category better, please feel free to reach out to us at AI Palette. My contact details are on the screen. With that, May, we can open up the